Hello. Today we are going to talk about installing OpenRose in a network environment. The first scenario that we're going to discuss is installing all required components in a single computer, which could be a server computer or perhaps a desktop computer, in which we will start by making sure that the required components on which OpenRose needs to run are present in that target environment. The reason we are discussing this today is to make sure that we give you an overview about how this installation can be implemented and how it can help corporates or teams who have network connected computers to basically allow multiple users to connect to OpenRose over a browser URL, which is pointing to one of the server that is sitting within the network within your company or within the team that is connecting and using OpenRose for requirements management purposes. So on the target computer, which is a Windows server or perhaps just a desktop computer, which is available on the network, you install IIS. And inside the IIS, you install two separate applications. One is OpenRose Web UI and the other one is OpenRose API. And on the same server, you can also install SQL Server, which is the database. Once these three components are installed, then we need to make sure that we establish connection between them. Web UI connects to API using the localhost API URL, and that will be implemented in app-settings.json file. And OpenRose API connects to SQL Server using connection string. Now, every application that is deployed in IIS is running under application pool. An application pool account is created in Windows so that you can use the inbuilt IIS pool account to communicate or to authenticate from OpenRose API over to SQL Server. So the option number one here is to connect or authenticate the API to SQL Server using the application pool account itself. The advantage of this option is that you don't have to remember any user ID and password. It is all self-contained. And so when you upgrade OpenRose API application, you don't need to provide the user ID and password or maintain app-settings.json file. The other advantage is that you never store your user IDs and passwords in a plain text or any secured form. You don't need to remember them because it's all using integrated security or Windows integrated account, which is nothing but IIS app pool account. We'll also talk about domain service account later on, where we may expand this scenario to deploy different components on different computers. The option number two is in SQL Server, you can define or configure it to authenticate users using both Windows identities as well as SQL Server user accounts or service accounts. Now you can use the user ID and password that is defined in SQL Server and provide those information in connection string, which could be within the app settings.json file or environment variable on the computer where you are deploying OpenRose API. Now I'm talking about all these things today to make sure that I provide information about how one could deploy OpenRose in a network environment. You would perhaps require help from your IT team or people who are hosting applications in IIS on your network computers so that they can help you with the final installation if you do not have access to such network environments or target environments which contains IIS. And if you do not have access to the domain services, which is where you create service accounts in your domain so that it can be used for establishing connection between the OpenRose API and SQL Server. Okay, so let's look at the scenario wherein everything is installed on the same computer. Now, let me go over to my IIS And let me start by showing that I have these two applications deployed, the OpenRose API and OpenRose Web UI. Web UI communicates to API using app settings.json, where you define the information about where is my API application. But before we go and look into that, let me just go into bindings here and show you that 7673 is the port number used for binding the OpenRose Web UI application. Now let me just go into Explore here, and this will show me the directory in which the application is deployed. Let me open app settings.json file and bring it over to this screen. And we can see that it is connected to port number 6736, which is where it is expecting the API application to be running. So 7673 is the port number used for Web UI, and the API is running or is expected to be running on 6736. So that's the API port number. Now, if I go back to IIS and then go to API and look at the bindings, then you can see that I have configured it to communicate or listen for incoming request on port number 6736. And if I explore the API, then here in app settings, we should be able to see the connection string. Now, by default, it is just using the standard connection string, which is the value by default provided by the installer of the zip file. So this is the standard value which we will be overriding. Now, there are two ways to override this value. You can either override it in place here, which is nothing but the app settings.json file, or you can override this value in environment variable. So let me just go and open the environment variable and show you here that in the system environment variable, I have got connection string, and there I am specifying that I would like to connect to SQL Server, which is on the same computer, the local computer, which is named Bagheera, and the SQL Express is my database server, and then I have database called as OpenRose DB. We'll look into these connections in SQL Server soon, but as you can see, I'm not passing any user ID and password, which means I'm trying to use the inbuilt Windows integrated security that would be using application pool. Now, what is this application pool? Let me just close the environment variables. Let's go back to the basic settings, and you can see that in OpenRose API site is using OpenRose API application pool, and that is nothing but an application pool defined here. So this application pool is also being defined in Windows as identity. So let's go back to the diagram. Here we can see that my OpenRose API is using OpenRose API application pool, and that account will be used to communicate to SQL Server. Now, if we want to use application pool account to connect to SQL Server, then we have to make sure that in our SQL Server, we have added that application pool account as DB owner for our database. So first thing we have to do is to add that account, IIS app pool, and the application pool name. That's the actual naming convention to identify the Windows account for the IIS application pool. And that's the OpenRose API app pool, exactly how we see this in Internet Information Services. And that account is added to OpenRose database. To do that, to be able to work with that, what we have to do is we have to first add this account to the server itself, which is the local computer. In my case, it's called Bagheera. And in that server, we have added the OpenRose API app pool first, and then we add that account to the database. You could do that manually here, or we have created a small script for the same. So here you can go into the wiki for OpenRose. That's the URL. Once you are in the wiki, you can go and look at this SQL script to add application pool. Here we are just showing you information about how you could use this script to automatically add the application pool user. So the ignore me has to be replaced with the application pool. And in my case, this is going to be IIS app pool, OpenRose API app pool. That will be used here. And then OpenRose DB, if that is what you want to use as the database name, then you just pass these two information. The person who needs to run this command should be having sysadmin role on the database. Basically, what it's doing is first using your sysadmin credentials or permissions, it's adding that user in, which is nothing but application pool user, into the server. And then, so this is just adding the user into the server or creating the login for that user. And the second part here is to add the user to the database and give that user a DB owner role. Once the user have the DB owner role, it will be able to work with this database to do all the CRUD operation. And if it needs to also do any updates to the schema, as in when you upgrade the new version of OpenRose, then it will perform those seamlessly behind the scene when you do the upgrades, because this user will have all the necessary rights on the database. So that is our first option. You can, if this script helps you, then please go ahead and use the script. And the second option is to rather use the SQL Server user ID and password. So one could simply also go into SQL Server, and then here on the server, if you look at the properties and under security, you define, would you only allow users to connect using Windows authentication only, or SQL Server as well. If you allow users to connect using SQL Server, then you can also go ahead and create a user. In my case, I have this SA user and I have created the password for the user. And then you can use in your connection string the user ID and password. And that connection string could be sitting directly inside the app setting files. So I'm just going to IIS, OpenRose API, explore this and open app settings. And as you know, I can pass that information here using user ID and password as well, and replace this with the correct connection string. Or I could again override this default value with the environment variable, and that environment variable should be called connection strings underscore underscore items context. Okay, so with that, we have already discussed about how we could deploy all the components in a single computer. Now let's start the IIS. So far my IIS was stopped, so you can see nothing is running. The entire server is stopped. Let me just go back to the browser and verify that port number 7673, the local host port number 7673, is not accessible. It's not working. So if I just try to start this or try to connect to that location, then obviously it's going to fail. As you could see that I can't reach that page. Let's go back to IIS. Let's start IIS. I'm just using Windows integrated communication method between the API and the database. And so I don't need to pass any user ID and passwords. And now that I have started the server, I should be able to connect to 7673, which is the port number on which these application is running. So 7673 is nothing but the web UI. That's why I'm able to connect and see the web UI. And then if I go to the project, then it's web UI communicating to the API and bringing me all the information about the projects. And that projects that is served is coming from the database, which means the API is communicating to the database. I'm still using localhost URL here, but if your IIS and the Windows server on which you install this application is in the network, in the corporate network, then you will be provided with the correct URL by your IIS administrator that will allow you to communicate directly to that specific network URL. Mostly it will be deployed in the default port number 80. That means it will be the default site on that instance of IIS. So you will not have to provide any port number. But if IIS admin for your company or for your team decides to install and configure it on a different port, then obviously he or she will provide you with the correct URL to communicate and work with OpenRose on that specific network address. With this, we covered the entire possibility of doing the deployment in a network environment on an IIS on a single server. The other option is to also install a separate instance of SQL Server. So what I'm going to show here is that we have a separate computer on the network, and I would like my database to be sitting somewhere else, not on the same server where my web application is sitting. So you could easily implement this. Again, in this case, you could use this option number 2, where you have the SQL authentication. So you create the user in SQL Server and provide user ID and password in the connection string so that API application can communicate with SQL Server. If you don't want to do that, then you could also create domain service account in your network domain, and that service account needs to be configured both in IIS as well as in SQL Server so that it can be authenticated, i.e. API can be authenticated against SQL Server. With domain services, you maintain the user ID and password of that service account in Active Directory or in the domain services. So that's another option that you could incorporate. The third option is you want your front end to be on a separate instance or environment. You want your back end to be on a separate instance. So I'm just going to take this guy and move it around. So we have 3 computers, and by the way, here also we should have IIS. So let's bring this to front. And here also you will have IIS. So let's bring it to front and bring this to front as well. Okay, so in this instance, what we have is 3 separate computers. 2 of them has got IIS installed. We have our web UI, which is the front end, where all the users connect to. That front end is on its own server. So there's only one application pool containing that specific application. On a separate server, you will have OpenRose API installed. When you do it in this form, then the establishment of the communication between web UI and the API will be not via localhost URL, but the URL of the API. What I mean is in your IIS, let's consider that the API is not here, only web UI is here or installed on a separate IIS instance. Then when you explore and open the app settings, then this URL for you will not be localhost anymore because the API is moved to a separate instance of IIS. So you will be using the URL of this particular instance of IIS. Let me also bring this to the front so we can see that as well. Both those options. And then if I go over to the SQL Server, then obviously I will be using either the domain services or I'll be using SQL Server user ID and password. Both these can be used in the connection string that can be from the environment variable. So this topology can also be incorporated to allow OpenRose to deploy in a multi-tier environment within your corporate network. Okay, so with that, I would like to conclude this video. I'm showing all this information that will help your technical team to decide how they want to do the deployment of OpenRose in your network. The architecture of the application enables administrators to be more flexible and decide how they would like to do the implementation based on your requirements as well as the network capabilities. Thank you so much for your time and have a great day. Bye now.